All right, this is the second half of the conversation about the courts, the judicial branch. And when we left off, we just talked about Marbury versus Madison. And remember, that's the case that established the power of judicial review for the courts. And it is the basis for the fundamental power that the judicial branch wields in our political system. And again, exercising judicial review, calling something unconstitutional is, in many senses, really the final say on that question, because amending the Constitution is so difficult to do. So next I want to get into three broad eras, and potentially a fourth era that we might be in now, about how the courts have exercised that power. So these eras refer to the sort of the dominant theme of the kinds of cases that the court decided during the eras, and the direction that the court was leaning for the most part. That's not to say that every single decision the courts made in these eras went the same way. They didn't. But for the most part, the courts had majorities that looked at these fundamental issues that the political system was grappling with and tended to decide them in a consistent way. So the first one was about the deciding undecided, unresolved questions about the relative roles and influence of state versus national government. And this was in the early part of the country's history, 1790 to about 1860 or so, up until the Civil War, basically. And so, again, the issue of federal versus state authority was one that the country grappled with in terms of debating the Constitution, and it was still sort of unsettled with the both levels of government were kind of feeling their way, and there was strong sentiment in some quarters in favor of states' rights and resistance to a national authority that was somehow supreme over states. And so that was really the nub or the theme of most of the important court decisions, one of which we've already talked about today, and that was the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. This was the case that revolved around the establishment of a national bank. Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, wanted to establish a national bank, and he argued that he was justified in doing so under the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, a national bank, in his view, being necessary to regulate commerce, which is a specific power given to Congress in the Constitution. And the states resisted that. The states didn't want the competition from national banks, so they tried to basically, in the state of Maryland in particular, tried to levy taxes against the national bank that would basically tax it out of existence. The Marshall Court upheld the right of the federal government to establish a national bank, and so his decision was a victory for those who wanted a more powerful, more assertive federal government, and a defeat for the states. So, but again, the key question here was what are the relative bounds of authority of state versus federal government? So the Marshall Court, and you'll remember from the story of Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall was a Federalist. The early political party that wanted a powerful federal government thought that was needed to rein in the states, and that stemmed from the problems that we talked about early on in this class about how the states functioned, the chaos and dysfunction under the Articles of Confederation when the states had all the power. So this was very much in keeping with Marshall's viewpoint about the need for a strong federal government, and so that decision went that way, no surprise. But Marshall died in 1835. And President Andrew Jackson appointed as his successor Roger Taney. And Taney was an advocate of states' rights, and he basically took the court in a different direction, away from national supremacy and more in line with the view that states should have rights. And his most infamous decision in the court that he led was the Dred Scott decision. And basically, Congress had passed a law outlawing slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line. And in Dred Scott, the Taney Court ruled that this was an unconstitutional infringement upon settlers' territorial rights to self-government. Dred Scott has gone down, rightly so, in my view, as one of the most infamous and poorly reasoned court decisions of all time. But again, the issue here was state versus federal authority, and the Marshall Court looked at it one way, the Taney Court looked at it another. That whole issue of slavery and its expansion could not be settled through the normal political processes, and so it was settled horribly through a civil war. After the Civil War ended, then we enacted the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which ended all questions about slavery and ended slavery. And so basically that settled that question. But again, the point here is that the normal political process and the court's decisions couldn't end it. This leads to the second era of judicial decisions, and this was after the Civil War until the 1930s, into the Great Depression. And the major issue here that framed many of the court's key decisions was the role of the government in regulating the economy on the one hand versus rights to property on the other. And this time it wasn't state versus federal government that was pitted against each other. It was both levels of government in their exercise of power in terms of regulating the economy, and whether either level of government, state or local, had the right to regulate the economy, or whether any economic regulation was a violation of property rights. And the context for this is the rapid industrial expansion of the country after the Civil War. As the country becomes more urbanized and more industrial, major industries arose and grew and became more and more powerful, and many people looked to the government to rein in those industries. Those industries were engaging in monopolistic practices. Think about the railroad trusts and the steel trusts. These are major industries, and it's hard to have a lot of competition in those industries. And so the largest players in those tended to acquire at least oligopolical, if not monopoly control. And so many looked to the government to break those up. But the courts didn't see it that way. The courts were more sympathetic to arguments about the fundamental nature of privacy rights. And this was the beginning of a constitutional tradition that emerged, and we still see today, that tried to shield businesses from economic regulation. And it had its origins in the concepts of fundamental rights of privacy that the framers espoused. And the argument here was that the 14th Amendment applied to businesses as well, that equal protection didn't apply just to people, but also to corporations, that corporations could be defined as people. And that's a concept that is debatable, but it's one that the courts sort of tied themselves to in making these decisions that shielded businesses from economic regulations, because those regulations were viewed as violations of the rights of these people, corporations, to property. And we'll come back to that notion of corporations as people a little bit later in this conversation. So, the Great Depression, starting in 1929, deepened, and the federal government attempted to intervene to alleviate some of the economic dislocation caused by the Great Depression, but the court continually rejected Roosevelt-era proposals, legislation, including things like the ones you can see on the list here: emergency relief programs, controlling the production of coal and basic agricultural commodities, regulating child labor, providing mortgage relief. The government tried to do those things, but the court rejected those using judicial review as unconstitutional infringements upon the rights of property that corporations, they said, ought to have. This began to change after Roosevelt's landslide election in 1936. He initially proposed, he was so frustrated by the courts thwarting his initiatives that he proposed packing the courts, expanding the size of the courts, and putting his personnel on there to turn majorities against him to majorities in favor of his proposals. And this was so blatantly political and unpopular that it went nowhere in Congress, but the court did begin to change its ways. There was a 5-4 decision in a case about wages and working conditions, and a court that had just 2 years earlier rejected that kind of thing embraced it finally. And then Roosevelt also was able to appoint 7 justices to fill vacancies. So he didn't enlarge the court and pack it, but 7 vacancies came up in about a 4 or 5 year period that he could put in his nominees, and that really turned the tide of the courts in his favor. The third era began after the Great Depression and after the Roosevelt era, and this was the third era that really framed many of the court's major decisions was the relationship between individuals and the government. And this came about because of the realization of the horrors of World War II and totalitarian regimes in Europe. And the court began to focus more on the preservation of individual rights and freedoms, and in particular, the rights of individuals when in the context or the guise of the criminal justice system, when the state had them in their power. And probably the hallmark of this era of judicial review was the 1960s Earl Warren Court's rulings that we've talked about before in the discussion on civil liberties, the selective incorporation of the Bill of Rights, the Miranda warnings and those kinds of things. So this was an era in which the court really wanted to protect the individual when in the context of our relationships to the government. Now, there may be a fourth era. These eras aren't really clear until they're clear in hindsight. You don't necessarily know that you're in a new era going through it. Looking back, there is some sense that we might view the current era as an era of the court functioning as a referee in disputes between the other branches of government. There's been a lot of decisions in the last several years where the court has reviewed things like executive orders, Donald Trump's travel ban on Muslims, Obama's DACA policy. The courts have also reviewed the powers of the bureaucracy, the implementation powers of the bureaucracy, and whether or not Congress has delegated too much authority to the bureaucracy in implementing complicated policies. In the summer of 2022, the court issued a decision that basically said the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't have the power to issue certain environmental regulations. That's too much authority, and only Congress can do that. So the court seems to be stepping in and refereeing disputes between the Congress and the executive branch and reviewing executive branch actions, and that seems to be one of the main things that is occupying the minds of the judges these days. On that point, I want to turn to the question of whether or not, in doing these things in the current era, the court actually functions as a neutral arbiter. And this gets back to the fundamental controversy we've talked about in terms of the courts that we started this discussion with. What do we make in a democracy where the unelected institution has the final say on the most controversial issues that the country faces? To mitigate concerns about that, the courts go to great lengths to try to impart an aura of impartiality. The robes, for example. Judges on the bench always wear robes. They literally come to the courthouse in street clothes, normal human clothes, and they have a locker room in which they change into their robes. Why? What do those robes do? Do those robes imbue them with a sense of neutrality and impartiality? Is it kind of like Harry Potter's invisibility cloak? You put it on and something magical happens to you? No, it's just a robe. But it imparts an aura of something different. This is not the normal political animal we're talking about. This is a person in a robe. The justices don't ever reveal how they voted in elections. I mean, if you know who they are and who appointed them in their politics, it's pretty obvious, but they don't talk about it. They don't openly campaign on behalf of political candidates or parties. This is changing lately. In the past, they would seldom or never appear at partisan political gatherings. That's happening more and more now. But still, the combined effect, or the point of all of these things, is to portray the judges as just neutral umpires. In his confirmation hearing, Chief Justice John Roberts described the role of the courts as simply calling balls and strikes, favoring neither one team or the other. Just call it as you see it. When a case comes along, you look at what the Constitution says and what precedent says, and you just make the decision based on the original intent of the founders, and that's it. Well, the reality is that the judiciary is a political institution, that judges are political actors. They're selected according to their political views by political presidents and confirmed by political senates. Their political views are very well known by the past decisions they've made. They've almost always worked in lower courts and been involved in that kind of decision making for decades usually. They have given speeches. They have published writings. All that stuff is available to be analyzed to discern their political point of view. There are screening organizations. The Federalist Society is a conservative judicial society, and they rate potential judges for the courts. And Donald Trump, when he was president, promised to appoint not one single judge that had not been approved and vetted by the Federalist Society, and he did that. And we'll talk in a second about how many judges that Trump appointed. Every one of them approved by the Federalist Society for their political views. And Democrats are just as careful about screening their potential judge nominees in ideological terms so that Democratic presidents nominate judges that will decide things that way. I want to tell you a story that lays bare the politics of judicial appointments and the importance and the ramifications of judicial appointments. This is the Supreme Court in 2016. You have four conservatives: Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Chief Justice John Roberts, and then the fourth is right here, the question mark. That is Antonin Scalia, or it was. He died early in 2016. I want to say in January of 2016. He was found dead of a heart attack in a cabin while on vacation. So there were four conservatives, counting Scalia, and four liberals: Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So the court had been basically 4-4 liberal conservative, and the ninth vote, so there were 9 Supreme Court justices, the ninth member was Anthony Kennedy, who was pretty moderate, and he could go either way on a lot of decisions. You really didn't know how he was going. He was often the swing vote in the court. Generally, the four conservatives would vote together, the four liberals would vote together, so you'd have a 4-4 tie, and whoever Kennedy voted, that was how the decision went. But then Scalia died. Barack Obama was president in January 2016. He had about a year left on his term. And so, of course, Obama nominated someone to the court. He nominated Merrick Garland, who is now the Attorney General. Garland was the most vanilla, moderate person Obama could find. And what he was trying to do was nominate someone that even a Republican-controlled Senate could not possibly object to. Except they did. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced a new rule, and the rule was that you don't confirm a vacancy to the Supreme Court during an election year. There was no such rule. It had happened many times in the past. Openings during election years had been filled on the court. He was making up this rule. But McConnell refused to hold hearings for Merrick Garland. Obama nominated Garland. McConnell refused to hold any confirmation hearings. The Senate refused to even consider, to even informally meet with Garland. There's a process before the actual confirmation hearings where the key senators on the Senate Judicial Committee, who have the first vote in either approving or not, or rejecting the nominee, the nominee goes to their offices and they do a tour and they kind of have these casual conversations, get to know each other. They refused to even do that. And what McConnell was hoping was that by leaving the seat open, he was hoping to recapture the presidency for the Republicans in 2016 and put someone else in place. But the Democrats were thinking, well, Donald Trump's not going to win the presidency. So you'd better take Merrick Garland, because if you don't, President Hillary Clinton is going to nominate someone far more liberal than Garland. So Democrats were outraged, but also kind of like, okay, we'll see. Donald Trump did win the presidency, as you know. And so Donald Trump then nominated Neil Gorsuch to fill that seat. So here was a seat that came open during a Democratic president's tenure that should have been filled by a Democratic nominee, which would have given the Democrats an extra, a fifth liberal vote on the court. Instead, it became a Republican seat. It stayed a Republican seat. It had been Scalia, a Republican, and it stayed that way with Gorsuch. Then, during Trump's presidency, Anthony Kennedy retired, and so Trump was legitimately then able to replace him, and he did so with Brett Kavanaugh. And then Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and Trump was able to legitimately replace her. Well, let's talk about the legitimacy of that appointment. He replaced her with Amy Coney Barrett. The thing is, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in October of 2020. The 2020 election was already underway. People had already started voting in that election. Remember that rule about you don't fill a vacancy during election year? Suddenly, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, there was no such rule. When it was a Democratic president in office, then there's a rule. When there's a Republican president in office, suddenly the rule is gone. And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and in one of the most rushed confirmation processes I've ever seen, she was replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. So this Supreme Court that had been basically 4-4 with a swing vote in 2016 turned into this Supreme Court. This Supreme Court suddenly now has 6 conservative justices and only 3 liberal justices. This in a country that is pretty evenly divided along ideological lines. It certainly isn't 6-3 in either direction. And that's because the Republicans basically stole this seat by not filling it when Obama was in office. So that should have been a 4th Democratic vote. And they should have had these 2. So those were sort of legitimate unless you ignore the rule, the supposed rule about not filling elections during election year. So the point of that is that judicial appointments are highly political. It's really about power. It's really about filling judges with people who ascribe to your political point of view. And in a highly partisan, polarized era, that becomes ever more of paramount importance. And the primary legacy that Donald Trump, I think, can claim as president is his ability to reshape the federal judiciary. Here's a look at Donald Trump's judicial appointments as president. In addition to 3 Supreme Court justices, which is a third of the bench, that's a lot. He also appointed 54 appellate court justices and 174 district court justices. That's pretty close to Barack Obama's record in judicial appointments. And remember, Trump did this in just 1 term. And these appellate court positions are particularly important because he often was able to switch the majority. These are usually 3-panel appellate court judges. There's usually a panel of 3. He was able to switch the majority to 2-to-1 conservative that had been 2-to-1 liberal on many of those. That's a very profound switch, remembering, of course, that these judges serve for life. They don't leave office when Trump leaves office. They're still there. So Trump had a great influence in putting people of his political philosophy, conservative, in the federal court positions. Let's talk about how judicial review is exercised. And there really are 2 competing philosophies, allegedly. There actually isn't. There's actually one. But we'll pretend for a minute that there are 2. The first is called restraint, judicial restraint. And this is typically espoused as a conservative political philosophy that says we should give deference to elected bodies, so don't overrule the actions of elected bodies wherever possible. Only do so when they have gone beyond the bounds of the Constitution, and when rejecting what elected bodies have done, calling it unconstitutional, do so by paying attention to precedent and the original intent of the founders as expressed in the Constitution. So that's the philosophy of judicial restraint, and it's typically associated as a conservative political philosophy. The counterpoint is judicial activism, which says that yes, defer to elected bodies, but also precedent sometimes is wrong. Dred Scott was a horrible precedent. Plessy versus Ferguson was a horrible precedent. Thankfully, later courts rejected both of those. As to original intent, the original intent of the founders, that is such a problematic concept. First off, it's often unknowable. It's often unclear. Many of the founders fundamentally disagreed with each other on basic issues. So whose intent are you paying attention to? That's a very murky concept. So under the guise of judicial activism, judges consider themselves more free to use their own judgment about what's best for society in the current time when making decisions, and not trying to discern whatever some founders would have wanted 200 years ago. As I said, judicial activism that's a charge often leveled at liberal judges. It's regarded as legislating from the bench. So unelected judges imposing their will on the rest of the people. And one example of this that critics of judicial activism would often cite is the Roe versus Wade decision, the decision that was overturned in 2022 in the Dobbs decision. The Roe ruling on abortion rights rested on a right to privacy. As we've discussed when we talked about civil liberties, privacy is not mentioned in the Constitution. So this was a right that was inferred by the court in Roe, and then the decision for Roe was based on that inferred right to privacy. But it's hard to look at the original intent of the founders, certainly any specific language in the Constitution, and say, well, clearly they wanted people to have a right to privacy. As I mentioned, as I argued, when we talked about civil liberties, there's also the Ninth Amendment that says that the list of rights included in the Bill of Rights is not the full extent of it. There are others. But that, never mind, critics would say, there is no specific right to privacy in the Constitution. And that was the basis that the Alito Court used last summer 2022, in rejecting Roe. However, there are just as many examples of conservative judicial activism. The text talks about the Heller gun rights decision that a conservative court handed down, which was very activist. I'm going to mention another one, and that's the Citizens United case that was handed down in 2010. This was a case involving campaign finance, and it struck down basically about 100 years of precedent and legislation by elected bodies. So the two things that judicial restraint says you should respect, defer to elected officials and pay attention to precedent. The Citizens United decision struck down about 100 years of legislation attempting to rein in and limit as much as possible the role of outside money in our elections. The Citizens United ruling was based on the premise that we talked about earlier, that things like outside groups and corporations are people, and they have the same rights as people, including the rights to political expression. And one type of political expression is making political contributions. And so any limits on political contributions by corporations, by unions, according to Citizens United, is unconstitutional. Well, okay, that's a very activist take on the question. This was a conservative court who took a case about Citizens United, expanded it well beyond what the actual case was about. The court normally decides things as narrowly as possible, but this court took the opportunity to expand the decision and issued a ruling that undid 100 years of elected officials' work and precedent, and that's activism in a conservative direction. By the way, the result of Citizens United, this is the amount of money being poured into our elections from outside entities, not from the two political parties, but just outside independent groups, corporations primarily. And I don't know how well you can see this amount of independent spending, but here, this bottom axis is the time, the election year, and you can see how small it is. There's 2004, 2006, 2008, 2010 was the last election we had before Citizens United was announced. Look at what happened in outside political spending immediately after that. 2012, 2016, 2020. It had been less than half a million dollars. In the 2020 election, it was close to $3 billion. That's $3 billion of outside money being spent to try and influence our election process. That's really unaccountable. It's dark money. We don't know where most of it came from. And if you're wondering why there are peaks and valleys here, why 2012 and 16 and 20 are much higher than 14, 18, and 2022, that's because 12, 16, and 20 are presidential election years. So that's the big one. 14, 16, and 18 are off-year midterm elections. So there's less interest, less spending on those. This is the direct result of this, a highly activist decision. The point I want to make is that neither liberal nor conservative courts are neutral umpires. They pretend to be with all the stuff about the robes and the air of impartiality, but they're not. I mean, sometimes the courts surprise us. The Roberts Court upheld Obama's Affordable Care Act in 2012 when everyone thought they were poised to strike it down. So it's not that they're completely predictable, but far more often the courts rule as expected. And this has caused some concern about whether the court is losing its legitimacy in the American political system. And in particular, the decisions of last summer of 2022, when the courts in the Dobbs decision overturned Roe versus Wade, and in that same basically 2-week span of issuing decisions, they also issued a decision on gun control and a decision on climate change that was very much at odds with the majority of public opinion in the United States. The court got a lot of flack, and Chief Justice John Roberts actually went public trying to defend the court. And he said, simply because people disagree with an opinion is not a basis for criticizing the legitimacy of the court. The fact that we don't like what they did, that doesn't mean that what they did was illegitimate. Okay, except that's not the point. The point is not that the court decided something that was contrary to what the public would have wanted. It's the process by which that ruling came about. It's the process by which a 6-3 conservative majority on the court was assembled, a nakedly partisan political process that led directly to those 3 decisions in the summer of 2022. I haven't decided yet, as I'm recording this, whether I'm going to have you read this New York Times article that's referenced here, Legitimacy is for Losers. In case I don't, the point of the article is that the concept of legitimacy in terms of our judicial system, the courts, it's mostly important for those who are on the losing end of decisions. if you lose, if a decision goes contrary to what you would have liked, as long as you believe that the process by which it was decided was legitimate, it was kosher, then you're probably okay with that. In the same way that if you're a Padres fan, and when they lose, as they tend to do, even this year when they're supposed to be good, you attribute the loss to they got outplayed, not to some conspiracy by the umpiring crew to screw them over. As long as you perceive the process of the games as being legitimate, you can accept the outcome, the loss, even though it's not what you wanted. And the same logic is really important for the courts. And I'm pretty sure that John Roberts understands that, despite what he says here. And the reason I know that is because about 15 years earlier, the same John Roberts had this to say as he was coming in as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was worried about the current court that he was taking over in 2007, about it being perceived as having less credibility, less legitimacy. And he was comparing the current court to how the Marshall Court, one of the first Supreme Courts in our history, how they decided things. So he said, if the court in Marshall's era had issued decisions in important cases the way this court has over the past 30 years, we would not have a Supreme Court today of the sort that we have. That suggests that what the court's been doing over the past 30 years has been eroding, to some extent, the capital that Marshall built up. He's concerned about a loss of legitimacy and credibility on the court because of how they've been deciding their decisions. And he ends this quote by saying, I'm concerned about having new justices on the court. I don't want the court to seem to be lurching around because of changes in personnel. That's exactly what today's court is perceived as doing. The decisions that I mentioned that this court made, overturning Roe versus Wade, rulings against gun control, and rulings making it more difficult to combat climate change, rulings that are completely at odds with large majorities of public opinion, they only made those rulings because of the change in personnel from this court. This court would never have issued those decisions. It couldn't have happened. And I'll also mention here that these three justices at the top here, Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh, they were all appointed by a president who lost the popular vote by 3 million votes, Donald Trump. The senators who confirmed them in their confirmation hearings represented a distinct minority of Americans. The senators who voted against them represented a majority of the Americans. And that harkens back to the anti-majoritarian bent of the United States Senate that we talked about back early on in this class, that favors smaller states would tend to be more conservative. So there's a definite anti-majoritarian process that has built this 6-3 conservative majority that has handed down these unpopular decisions. And so, Chief Justice John Roberts is right to be concerned about the court losing its legitimacy and its credibility because of its lurching around making decisions as a result of changes in personnel on the court. That's exactly where we're at today. Closing thought. This is what that has done to public opinion and our views of the courts. The courts have always enjoyed the highest level of public opinion of all our political institutions. Congress is usually the lowest, always the lowest. The presidency is usually somewhere between around 50%, in that range. In today's highly polarized era, it's hard for presidents to achieve a 50% approval rating because you're guaranteed to have all of the other side against you, so you're already kind of stuck at a ceiling of 50%. But the courts have always enjoyed approval ratings in the 60% range, until now. You can see this. The green is approving this. I guess that's orange, rust. I don't know what that color is. This is the disapproval rating. The approval ratings have always been higher than disapproval until this series of decisions. And now a majority of Americans actually disapprove of the job that the Supreme Court is doing. What does it mean if the court is regarded as illegitimate? What does it mean for the country? Well, this is one assessment, and I'm just going to read it. The Supreme Court has only as much power as people believe it does. Constitutionally speaking, the court does not have the hard authority of the presidency or Congress. It cannot deploy the military or cut off funding for a program. It can order others to take actions, but these orders only hold force if the other branches of government and state governments believe they have to follow them. The court power depends on its legitimacy, on a widespread belief among citizens and politicians that following its orders is the right and necessary thing to do. And the author is right. The court can't, it has no enforcement power. It has no implementation power. It issues orders, it issues rulings, and we implement them, we follow them because of a fundamental belief that the court has the legitimacy to do so. Continuing on with a quote, in the American system, for better or worse, the court is supposed to serve as a final arbiter of political disagreements. If it lacks the legitimacy to play that role, it sets the stage for a constitutional crisis, especially if former President Donald Trump runs again in 2024. This was written about a year ago, almost to the day from when I'm recording this. And of course, former President Donald Trump is running again in 2024. He's the leading contender for the Republican nomination for the presidency. He's also under two indictments so far, one state and one federal. That's exactly the sort of constitutional crisis looming for which we would need a final arbiter to step in and issue a ruling, a decision to resolve the matter that is potentially right before us of a president being elected and also being imprisoned. And what do you do with that? That's why we need a legitimate judicial branch, a court system whose rulings we can accept as fundamentally valid. When we're in this situation where that legitimacy is questioned, that's the sort of constitutional crisis, potentially, that they're talking about here. On that happy note, I'm going to end this lecture.